I'm constantly asked about how small towns can create good transit systems. But a better question might be how small towns can make it so that residents can live sustainably and also car-free or just car-light. The town of Whistler in Canada is actually a masterclass on this in many different ways. With less than 12,000 residents, it's actually doing a ton of things that our much larger urban areas could learn a lot from. And of course, transit and sustainable mobility play a big role. So resort towns can be a bit tacky, but Whistler does a really good job, even in the ultimate culprit for tackiness, the Central Village. The Village Stroll, as it's called, is entirely car-free. And you aren't even supposed to cycle in it because it tends to be so full of people walking about. Amazingly, this is one of the few places in Canada, and possibly even in North America, where you'll see major brands fronting onto a fully pedestrianized street. And the businesses do just fine. In fact, a lot of them feel busier than the ones you'd see at a suburban strip mall. To be totally clear, you can drive here in Whistler, and a lot of people do, unfortunately. However, all of the parking and most of the access for most buildings, especially in the Village, is from the rear. This simple design decision maintains car access but allows the Village itself to be a beautiful pedestrianized space where you don't have to cross parking lots or ugly roads to access businesses and just hang out. This all works without tons of major issues, and even hotels and housing have their access from the back, as with loading docks where businesses can receive deliveries of the various things they sell and produce. In fact, in the Village itself, there isn't even all that much surface parking, as a lot of it is underground beneath the buildings. Things aren't all perfect though. A big issue you see with a lot of the older buildings is that their access tends to be up some stairs, elevated above the regular pedestrian street. And while this looks aesthetically maybe a bit more interesting, and it's probably also a bit more architecturally interesting, it's worse for access for a lot of people with different mobility needs, and so providing direct access off the street, as you see with a lot of the newer buildings, is definitely better. Now what was awesome is one day we woke up quite early and we actually got to see how the servicing and landscaping and maintenance of the actual pedestrianized areas of the city works, as well as removing waste. And they actually use these adorable tiny trucks which trottle along the pedestrian areas at low speeds, so that was quite cool to see. What you'll also notice is that bike racks are everywhere. And this is in addition to the large bike parking facilities that exist in basically every large building. At the same time, there's a lot of seating because just hanging out here is really nice without all of the cars and noise that comes with them. What's amazing is that despite the fact that Whistler is a beautiful nature and adventure destination, is that a lot of people come here just to visit the Village because it's so nice. We came during the off-season, when prep for skiing is starting to begin, and while wind down for mountain biking, which Whistler is a mecca for and is quite famous for, is happening. But what was amazing to see was that even early in the mornings, the Village was busy because people had places to go and there is so much that you can conveniently access here. During peak bike season, but also outside of it, you'll see a ton of people cycling around the Village and other parts of Whistler, as the whole wider region has an excellent network of paved multi-use paths that let you go to almost all areas of the city without having to cross or even ride along a lot of streets. Now, since Whistler is not a giant urban center and a lot of people do drive here, even if only for day trips from Vancouver, there is more parking here than I would like, often in fairly large surface parking lots. That being said, over the years more and more bus services have started up, connecting to Vancouver and its airport as well as other destinations. And at the same time, people who do drive here for longer trips, say a weekend or a week up here to come cycling or skiing, often do leave their car parked basically the entire time and get around walking, cycling, or taking public transit. Public transit access from here to Vancouver could obviously be much better, and it is a major priority for the future, since a lot of communities like Squamish in between Whistler and Vancouver have been growing a lot in recent years. If you're wondering, there is actually a rail line between Vancouver and Whistler, but it's super windy, and currently it's really only used for a limited and not very fast tourist service. However, I think with some infrastructure improvements and some better, nice modern trains, think something like a Stadler Flirt or an Alstom Lint, you could have a pretty compelling, if not super fast rail service that would be passable for going from North Vancouver, at the C-Bus for example, up to Whistler, but also for traveling between some of the smaller communities on the Sea to Sky corridor. What might surprise you is that despite the fact that Whistler isn't all that well connected to Vancouver with bus and public transit services, is that Whistler itself, for a village of just 12,000 people, has pretty good transit service. In a lot of ways, it's actually higher quality than a lot of larger urban areas in the US. The network has 7 or 8 different routes, and they aren't really all that high frequency. Routes tend to operate every 20, 30 minutes, or even every hour. But because they're clock-face scheduled, as I talked about in a previous video up here, they're consistent, and so you don't have to wait for a bus since you just go out when the bus is coming. And this generally works quite well for Whistler because as a small town, the roads generally just aren't all that congested. The network here even has a nice central bus exchange, and it could be nicer. Something semi-indoor with a lot of nice next bus arrival screens would be a huge level up, but it's still decent. And since all of the province of British Columbia's transit outside of Metro Vancouver is operated by a single agency called BC Transit, very creative, there are actually plans to implement a smart card system on all of the smaller BC Transit systems across the province, which will mean that Whistler should have a nice smart card and contactless payment option in the next few years, which is great for convenience. The buses themselves are not zero emissions, and I have heard people discussing ideas like range-extended trolley buses, which could actually work pretty well. Currently, they're all compressed natural gas, which, to be fair, is a lot less polluting than diesel and is quite popular in BC in general. But interestingly, these buses are actually somewhat of a downgrade from around the 2010 Olympics to the mid-2010s, which were actually zero emissions and powered by hydrogen. Unfortunately, at the time, hydrogen infrastructure and power systems were less developed, at least in this part of North America. And so hydrogen had to be trucked in from hours away to Whistler itself, which, along with all of the complicated maintenance because of the fuel cells and complex electronics, made those buses incredibly expensive to operate. Housing in Whistler, as you probably imagine, is difficult and complicated. But there are various interesting initiatives which have happened over the years to try to make the market a little more sane, especially for people who work up here. Fortunately, employees generally get low-cost, guaranteed subsidized housing, which is provided by the resort itself, and which actually sort of gets its own dedicated bus route. With regard to staying here, there have been more and more affordable options provided over the years, including a pod hotel, which is quite cool. Now, as I said before, I'm not going to lie, there is a lot of parking in Whistler still. Largely for people who are taking day trips up here that could, and probably should, be replaced by public transit. But at least Whistler doesn't really have any freestanding parkades marring the nice landscape. There are surface parking lots, but they could hypothetically be removed when we provide better transit service. And at the same time, there's actually a ton of EV charging here, which is great to see. BC is actually the province in Canada with the highest adoption rate of electric vehicles, with over 10% of new cars on the road being electric, and it would probably be more if more electric cars could actually be produced. While EVs obviously shouldn't be a band-aid solution for the abominable lack of public transit in so much of North America, or lack of good public transit, at the very least, they mean that the cars that often do need to exist either now or in the long term, for things like servicing, commerce, and business, they're at least a better, much lower polluting alternative to our existing fossil fuel vehicles. Fortunately though, there was an even better type of electric vehicles here in Whistler, because Evo, a car sharing company from Vancouver that probably deserves its own video, we actually saw some car shares up here, which again just suggests that there should be better public transit up here, has actually started up an e-bike sharing system. These semi-dockless shared bikes are really good to see and something that way more cities should be adopting. What's even cooler though about the EVs and the electric bikes is where the power actually comes from. BC, like other parts of Canada, gets a very high percentage of its power from hydroelectricity, which is zero emissions. But in the case of Whistler, it's even cooler because the town actually has its own hydro plant that exists between Whistler and Blackcomb Mountains and feeds off of the flow of the glacier-fed Fitzsimmons Creek. The idea of zero emissions electricity is really cool, but the idea of locally generated zero emissions electricity is even cooler because it means that the people working at the power plant actually can live in the community that benefits from that energy. Now, as you've seen, Whistler is not perfect, and I could name 100 different things that we could do to make it even better. But what I really do think is impressive is how this small town is actually better than a lot of cities in so many different areas of sustainability, land use, and transportation. It really goes to show how small policy interventions and smart forward planning can make a small town an incredible place to live, and we need far more of this. Thanks for watching.